Hey, greetings and welcome to week 3, and this is lecture 2. So we left off the last lecture and we were talking about how our culture, the culture that we live in currently, makes it difficult for us to live into the version and the dream of who we want to be in Christ. This idea that we have this picture of who God has called us and created us to be, how the spiritual formative rhythms and practices of the faith should help to facilitate that growth, that maturity, that sanctification, that deepening, that movement towards the vision of who we're supposed to be in Christ. But we also talked about how the culture that we live in currently, makes the pursuit of that dream very difficult, either by having us consistently distracted, having us live constantly enmeshed in busyness, and one in which we always have some sort of expectations surrounding us, and it leaves us living willy-nilly and haphazard. Now, this isn't only our problem. This has been a problem historically for humanity. We are naturally a fickle human kind, and we can get drawn off course, we can get distracted, we can get lazy, and we all have a way of allowing our imposters to move us in directions counter to or contrary to what God desires for us. And so in monastic life, back in the 5th, 6th century of the early church, there was a monk by the name of Benedict who will become known as Saint Benedict. He institutes in his monastic life a rule, and it's going to become known as Saint Benedict's rule, and it will be implemented for hundreds of years in many monastic communities after that. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds about the actual rule itself, because that is one of the spiritual practices that we'll be able to discuss further towards the end of this class. But I do want to just mention that it helped to order life in the monastic community, because again, we have a tendency to be willy-nilly, we have a tendency to live haphazardly, reactively rather than proactively, and we don't always have a strategic, disciplined framework that will help move us in the right direction. And so Saint Benedict instituted this rule for monastic life that helped to order the life of the monks there, so that they moved by certain rhythms, that they lived by certain patterns, that they practiced certain spiritual disciplines, all of which he believed would help facilitate the kind of growth and maturity in Christ that all of the monks longed for. And I think for us, that is key, is that we want a framework that's going to facilitate our growth, our formation, our maturity, and our longevity as ministers of the gospel and as the people of the church. And so we want to take this seriously. Now, it's really important for me to also say that one of the challenges of spiritual disciplines, if we're not careful, is that where we will start to serve the spiritual discipline rather than the spiritual discipline serving us. And we tend to get those mixed. So we set a framework in place, or we say, I'm going to do this. And then it becomes about the thing itself rather than what we believe that thing is going to facilitate in our life. So let me give you an example with Jesus. Jesus is walking through the field with his disciples, and it's on a Sabbath, and they pick grain as they're going through the disciples so that they could eat, and the Pharisees called him into account for that infraction of the law. How dare you pick wheat on the Sabbath? And Jesus makes a profound statement. He says, man does not exist to serve the Sabbath. Sabbath exists for man. There's this idea that the spiritual practices of the church, the spiritual practices of the community of faith, should serve to facilitate the kind of growth and maturity that we seek or believe that God is calling us into in our walk and in our journey with God. And so as we begin to set some pieces in place for this framework, this spiritual rule of life, it's important that this doesn't become another form of religious imposition or legalism in which you're constantly living in a state of guilt and constantly feeling like you're not living up to or failing at living into your rule of life. Your rule of life is a framework. It's a guide. It's a means by which you can look at your life seriously and honestly and begin to think through the rhythms, the patterns, and the practices that will help you to live more fully immersed in the grace and the goodness and the love and the purpose and the liberation of God in your life. So there's some key concepts that I want to talk to us about as we begin to deliver or begin to determine or shape our, maybe I should say craft our rule of life. The first of which is one that I want you to learn from me. So when I first did this, I actually got it kicked back. I know it's hard to believe. I handed this in to a professor and they gave it back to me. They kicked it back at me and they said, this will not do. Now, how can you kick back someone's rule of life back to them and say, this won't work? Well, what had happened is, without even realizing it, my imposter had been feeding into my rule of life. Now, as we're becoming more and more accustomed to the imposter, because you're reading Abba's Child, or you should be starting to work towards Abba's Child, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the imposter here. But as we make our way for the next 2 weeks, you're going to begin to discover what exactly I mean by the imposter. And in that, what I want to say to us is that I had written this rule of life, and it was so overly taxing. Like I was going to do this, and I was going to do that, and I was only going to do this here, and it was so restrictive and required so much energy. And my professor eventually said to me, how is this going to serve you at all? This is going to exhaust you trying to fulfill some rule of life. You've just given yourself a workout routine that you are incapable of living into. And that's when I realized that my achievement mentality, my desire to want to always do more, go further, be harder, achieve more, was influencing and infecting, I think, in a negative way, my rule of life. And so I want to give you a few concepts here that I think are going to help us as you begin to think through what your rule of life is going to be. The first one is it needs to be rhythmic. That one of the things we learn about spiritual formation, and there's a great book called Sacred Rhythms by Ruth Haley Barton, and it talks about how we are formed, that we've been crafted to learn to live into certain rhythms in this life. And so we want to, if you look at Israel's life, there were certain rhythms to life: feasting and fasting and celebrating and praying and lamenting, and there's these rhythms, patterns that are picked up in the life of a community, because patterns and rhythms are formative, and there's patterns and rhythms in the formative nature of the church calendar, and I think one of you are going to be doing the church calendar as a spiritual practice, and we'll talk more about that as we move forward throughout the rest of this class. But it needs to be rhythmic. So you want to think in terms of weekly, daily, perhaps even. You want to think in terms of daily. Then you want to talk about weekly, monthly, and then yearly. What are the rhythms and the patterns for your spiritual formation that are going to be life-giving? Are there patterns weekly where you're going to name when that Sabbath is going to be and what that Sabbath is going to mean for you? Are there monthly rhythms where you're going to take a pause from the busyness of life and you're going to spend a day or two with God, and you're going to reevaluate that month in light of everything that has happened and everything that you're leaning into? Yearly, what is that pattern and rhythm going to mean for you and maybe your family? How are you going to live into those healing and holistic rhythms? Now, don't make your rule of life so rhythmic or so constrained in its rhythms that there's no freedom or movement in there at all. And I think that's really important for us to be reminded of. Now, some of us who are overdoers or overachievers need to create space or rhythm, create space or margin in our rule of life for some freedom. For those of us that have a tendency to be a little bit more free-flowing with life, a little less disciplined, you may need to up the ante in how you define your rhythms. So it's going to be a lot of bit dependent upon who you are and the ways in which your posture may end up informing what it is that you do. The second thing I want to say is it needs to be realistic. Don't overdo it with it. Don't create such aspirational goals that every time you look at it, you're going to live in this sense of guilt or shame that you're failing to do the very thing that is supposed to bring you life. Because then it becomes self-defeating, and that is not what you want. You don't want a self-defeating rule of life. You want something that you can look at that calls you to be accountable, that pushes you into rhythms and disciplines, but doesn't have you constantly feeling as though you are a failure. Something that, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, something that you can evaluate, you can process through, you can come to understand better about its impact in your life, but then also gives you the kind of room so that you know that you can actually live out what it is that you're laying out as the groundwork and framework for your spiritual journey. And the third component is that it ought to be refreshing. At the end of the day, that's what a rule of life does. It helps to refresh us, renew us. It gives us a sense of renewed freedom and grace and joy and hope and peace in the journey of Jesus. That's what Sabbath ought to do. It ought to refresh us. Spiritual retreats that ought to refresh us. Times of fasting, in a sense, ought to renew and refresh our journey of faith. And so they're going to want to be rhythmic, realistic, and refreshing. And I think those are important concepts to keep in mind as we work through this rule of life that you're going to be writing, and as we develop the framework for the intentional, strategic, disciplined process for spiritual formation in your life.